Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bowl Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel, where we're going to be talking about this piece of paper today, where I've made my 53-man roster that is primarily chicken scratch, and you probably can't read a lot of it. It's okay, I can't either. But I wanted to watch the Niners game and, go in with a 53-man roster I built on Friday that I've since made some changes, that I've since made some adjustments to. And this is the 53-man roster initial that I came up with. I do think there's going to be waiver claims. I think there's going to be at least an attempt to get an offensive lineman in the building. There kind of has to be based on the numbers I made on the roster. But for now, this is where I think the initial 53-man roster will be. And I do think there will be more moves to come and more wheeling and dealing, as the Chargers have done last year and as they've done really every year after the creation of the 53-man roster. Keep in mind, you had stuff like 7 wide receivers last year with Cornelius Johnson and all that kind of stuff that existed on the roster before they kind of ended up getting to the real roster they wanted. But this was just a game of how do we create the best 53 and then, sort of shift some moves around to kind of like keep some guys from hitting waiver claims. There's a lot of games like that, of course, with the 53-man roster. One thing that we can't entirely predict before we get into this is IR spots. I tend to give a little bit more credit to Daniel Popper and Chris Rim and the reporters who were on site about like what guys could hit IR. So that kind of went into this line of thinking, even though I don't think it's like, automatic that someone like Junior Colson, who we'll talk about a little later, hits IR. The early indications are that it's pretty possible. So we'll kind of get into that when we do. And I also think, I'll talk about this specifically with the quarterbacks, but I don't think there's like an impossibility that they keep guys on their initial 53-man roster to possibly, look for trades and stuff like that too. I'll talk about that with the quarterbacks. I think this is the main group that we're going to talk about it with but I do have Justin Herbert and Trey Lance. 2 quarterbacks. Lance has pretty thoroughly outplayed Heinicke this offseason. I think it's really as simple as that, which going back to my spring priors and what a lot of Chargers fans thought when Trey Lance was first signed, I did not see this coming. Go back to the Trey Lance was signed post by the Chargers, and you'll see a lot of doubters and haters like myself. Credit to Trey Lance, who worked really hard this offseason, seemingly is a big favorite of the coaching staff with how he's handled himself. And I've been really impressed by some of the throws he's frankly made in these games and the fact that I think he has really caught up to the speed of the game now. I think that was an issue for him when he was in Dallas, when he was in San Francisco. So it's been a pleasant surprise this preseason to really see Lance play as well as he's played. DJ Uiagalelei is a name that I would mention for the practice squad here. Obviously had a pretty good first half last night. Not so great second half. But I think that he's someone that they're going to keep around, at least on the practice squad, to be kind of their, quasi-emergency 53 guy. Not that he's going to have that role directly because he won't be on the main roster, but could he be elevated in some weeks where, like, Herbert's injured and stuff like that? I think that that's at least a possibility. But yeah, Heinicke, I think at this point you just have to cut. Although I do think there is a possibility that they could do what the Falcons did last year and keep Heinicke on the initial 53-man roster and then try to find a trade for him. Unfortunate problem with that is I think other teams also have access to all 22. And if you do have access to it, it would make giving up a 6th or 7th round pick or a pick swap much less favorable, I think, for your football franchise, sadly. If I was running another team, I don't know if I'm picking up the call on Taylor Heinicke from Joe Hortiz. Thought I would at least bring it up as a possibility, but again, I think this is like a very 5-10% chance thing. I think for the most part, they're just going to roll with 2. Running backs, I do have them keeping 3. Omarion Hampton, Hassan Haskins, and Raheem Sanders. The big question is, can they find a way to keep Vidal on that initial roster? Now, they did keep 4 running backs last year on the initial with Jared Patterson, and they did the year before that with Elijah Dotson in Ryan Ficken's first year with the Chargers. So worth pointing out. I just thought there were a lot of names on defense that I just felt the Chargers probably wouldn't be comfortable putting on waivers after this preseason relative to Kimani. Another option for Kimani here is that they could place him on IR, although apparently he was working off to the side with trainers and practice and stuff like that, as opposed to like Junior Colson not being, on the field at all. So that could be a positive sign for him that his injury is not that bad. I really can see a world where they keep 4 based off of what they've done in the past. But the more I toiled with it, I just think it made sense to go with 3 for the time being, especially because Hassan Haskins does so much of the special teams heavy lifting. Of note with the running back room, outside of just my prediction that they keep Hampton, Haskins, and Sanders, Joe Hortiz did say on the broadcast last night that Najee Harris, they're hopeful he can play week 1. I don't really believe anything they're saying on the Najee Harris front, and until I see him practice, until we see him get back into that routine, I just don't feel comfortable putting him on the 53 now. That could come on Thursday. He practices for the first time, almost like a week before the Chiefs game, right? Maybe that gets him into the sweet spot, but he's been doing the walking, running with a weighted vest thing for like 3 weeks now, and there really hasn't been any movement on it. So, I believe it's possible. I believe he could certainly be on the 53-man roster if they don't think he's going to miss all 4 games, and maybe they think he's going to miss 2 or 3. I just think for now it's easier to stick him on the, NFI, and with the nature of his eye injury in particular, and how tricky those are to deal with, I kind of urge a little bit more caution than if this was just he was coming back from a hamstring, or he had a groin thing and he sat out most of the preseason. This is pretty clearly something that Najee Harris is adjusting to, and so I still think at the end of the day, in my heart of hearts, that he's hitting NFI. Could end up being wrong on that, but that's sort of what I had. Scott Matlock, fullback. I have him as the 6th player on the roster. I don't think that there's a whole lot of debate here. Scott Matlock was in street clothes yesterday, essentially meaning that he had locked up a roster spot. This will make a lot of people mad. I'm not even saying that I fully support the Scott Matlock fullback experiment, but look, he's playing on all 3 units, offense, defense, and special teams. He's going to be, they sat him in this Niners game. He is going to be on the roster. It's that simple to me. Moving on to 6 wide receivers. This would be Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, assuming he clears concussion protocol for the Chiefs game, which there were already pretty positive signs that he will be able to. Keenan Allen, Trey Harris, Keandre Lambert-Smith, and Darius Davis as sort of your special teams guy. So that brings us up to 12 on the roster. Nothing really to debate with the wide receivers, to be honest. There have been a lot of conversations online about Darius Davis and is he guaranteed a roster spot? And I just think if you listen to Ficken talk about him and how he's part of their core group of special teamers, I don't think he's really expendable to their operation at all. And then the idea of him being waiver claimed by someone else, as someone who's been in the league for a few years, has made highlight plays in preseasons and regular seasons before, core special teamer from his time at TCU and with the Chargers, I would be a little bit nervous about that one, frankly. And I think he's just a core part of this team and will be on the roster every week unless he's injured and they have to activate Jalen Reagor or something from the practice squad, like the routine last year. But I think for the most part, barring injuries, I think it'll be 6 wide receivers through the whole season. I did have 4 tight ends. Oronde Gadsden. My bad, Omarion ended. Oronde Gadsden, Will Dissly, Tyler Conklin, and then Tucker Fisk. Now, kind of in the same lines that I talked about with Vidal. I think Fisk is really veering like on that cut line of like, hey, if we bring in an offensive lineman, if we claim someone else, like you're probably the first guy, to be honest, that we're cutting. But I did have him in this initial just because I thought, compared to what I'm going to talk about with the offensive line next, compared to keeping Vidal, I did think it was at least a little bit more important to keep him on the initial roster, to keep him off of those initial claims. So that's why I sort of had him along with the other 3 tight ends. 8 offensive linemen is the number for me. Joe Alt, Zion Johnson, Bradley Bozeman, Kai Becton, Trey Pipkins, Jamari Salyer, Branson Taylor, and Andre James. I did not put David Sharp on my roster prediction. I know Daniel Popper did. I just don't see what the point of like keeping him is unless you're going to really consider keeping him as your swing tackle for the whole year, which it didn't really seem like we're on the verge of that with him. Greg Roman kind of called him like working back into football shape in his press conference. And I think there is the idea that he's not subject to waiver claims, that like you could pretty easily get him back on the practice squad. I think more than anything with this current offensive line group, there just has to be a move incoming. You have to do something about this. Like this is, look, the starting offensive line is what it is in Alt, Zion, Bozeman, Becton, and Pipkins. I don't understand how you go into the season with Jamari Salyer as both your swing tackle and your swing guard. And then if something happens to Jamari, you're on Branson Taylor watch, right? Like, or David Sharp, should he have made the roster, right? Like, they just need to acquire an offensive lineman, whether that is another guard who keeps Salyer out at swing tackle, or a tackle who keeps Jamari at swing guard. You just have to do something here. So I'm all for kind of cutting David Sharp in this scenario just to make the roster numbers work, but I kind of think it doesn't matter anyway because I think they will eventually sign a 9th offensive lineman, and I probably think that will be the Tucker Fisk roster spot that gets lost as a result. People talk about cutting Branson Taylor, but I frankly think just, to me, the only draft pick who's really at risk of being cut right now is Triquez, just because of the roster numbers at corner, and frankly, just hasn't been very good this preseason. But the Rashawn Slater thing, I think, really opens the door for Branson to probably have a spot, and I do think they will keep a 9th lineman at some point that will be your quasi-swing tackle, quasi-guard. Who those names are going to be, Stephen and Tyler talked about trade candidates. Stephen and Tyler talked about waiver claims, so I kind of I have not looked at like who are some backup OL options, to be honest, but I do think they'll be pretty aggressive at looking for someone here in the not-so-distant future. Defensive line, Tier Tart, Otito Ogbonya, Deshaun Hand, Jamari Caldwell, Justin Igboibe, Naquan Jones. Credit to Jones yesterday. He had a really, really good performance where I just thought he was pretty unwreckable. And just as a macro point, talking about this defensive line rotation, it has exceeded my expectations in a crazy way. And, we all kind of had, I think, a little bit of hesitance about going into this defensive line room post Poona Ford leaving. But honestly, everyone's been really impressive this season, this preseason. Naquan Jones looked good last night. I think Igboibe has looked way more playable compared to what he was last year. Certainly is defending the run a little bit better than he was given credit for in college, in training camp and stuff like that last preseason. Jamari Caldwell, obvious. He's had an awesome preseason, particularly those first couple games where he just kind of burst onto the scene. And I think he's going to have a pretty big role this year. Deshaun Hand, Otito Ogbonya, Tier Tart. 6 defensive linemen is normally a lot. It is more than 5, which I think is kind of like the average on these 53-man rosters. But the more I thought about it, I couldn't really leave any of them off. and I think Jesse Minter is going to use his full, all 6 of them probably in games. Maybe there will be game days where one of them is inactive and stuff like that. But I think all of these guys have played really well and deserve to be a part of the rotation. 5 edge rushers: Khalil Mack, Tuli Tuipulotu, Bud Dupree, Caleb Murphy, and Kyle Kennard. In an ideal world with what they've seen this preseason, I think it would be Kyle Kennard as the 4th edge rusher. And I don't think they would keep Caleb Murphy. But they have to keep Caleb Murphy. I just think you haven't seen enough from Kennard, who was playing pretty deep into the preseason game last night. Obviously, had some injury situations this camp as well. It hasn't been the preseason that people have, or that the coaching staff or fans were kind of expecting to see from him in terms of earning his roster spot. I still think he will be on the roster. You're not cutting your 4th round pick right out the gate. But shout out to Caleb Murphy, who's earned a spot here with what he's done as a pretty core Ficken special teams member, what he was able to do a little bit earlier this preseason when he had some great games. He's earned his spot and, frankly, is above Kennard in the rotation right now, which, I'm not writing the Kennard career eulogy certainly yet. I think he's someone that will continue to improve, but not the result I think you wanted to see this preseason, all things considered. But at least they did have some players like Caleb Murphy, Trayvon Morris-Brash, who I think they're going to want back on the practice squad, that I think will, at least keep the depth pretty good. Couple other, practice squad type notes that I just had on the roster, because I didn't talk about it a ton on offense. I did talk about DJU. I talked about Kimani, who I think is obviously a practice squad candidate. As far as wide receivers, Jalen Reagor's back, and I kind of think he's going to be a practice squad candidate to watch for there. You also have Dallavon Campbell kind of in the mix. Just with how much they used Reagor on special teams last year, how much Greg Roman loves Jalen Reagor. He loves him way more than I do. I do kind of think they find a way to keep him around. Others. Nesta Jade Silvera is someone that has kind of impressed this preseason on the defensive line. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if they kind of keep him around in the rotation. On the practice squad, not part of the starting lineup, obviously, or the 53-man roster, I should say. So then on the edge room, I did have Trayvon Morris-Brash as kind of a practice squad guy that I think can, achieve real reps should there be an edge injury or something like that. But the 5 they go with are Mack, Tuli, Dupree, Murphy, and Kennard. Adding up the numbers, because I haven't done this in a while, 2, 3, 1... That's, 5, 6, 12, 16, 24, 30. We're at 35 on the main roster, if I've added up all these things correctly. 4 linebackers. Dayon Henley, Denzel Perriman, Troy Dye, Delshon Phillips. Delshon Phillips, of course, coming back off of the PUP list earlier this week, or a week and a half ago, when he came back. Obviously, I think is going to be a thick-in core special teams guy. He was, sort of brought in to replace Nick Neiman. So I think he's pretty safely on the roster. The conversation that exists here is about IR and Junior Colson. A little bit of background on this. Of course, in Popper's report, he, was not seen at practice, unlike Kimani, who, seems to be dealing with a lesser injury, all things considered. And Harbaugh was asked if, he re-aggravated the same injury that he suffered earlier this preseason, and his response was, I don't know. Basically Harbaugh's whole thing is to not comment about injuries, but the tone of his voice kind of sounded like he did re-aggravate the same injury, but obviously he didn't say that. Obviously he didn't want to answer the question in general. But I just think in this roster construction, if Junior is not going to be able to go week 1, which is a possibility, I sort of think you have to IR him and play with these 4 guys. You can obviously also elevate someone like a Marlowe should he fall back to the practice squad. That's also someone worth talking about. I really, really, really wanted to find a spot for Marlowe, and I couldn't. Simply I think he could be a guy that, like, should he clear waivers and make the practice squad, which I kind of expect to happen, I think he's going to be maybe in this, practice squad elevation conversation should Junior Colson be placed on IR. I just couldn't find the spot for him because really it would require Colson getting cut, which, as much as people want to talk about it on Twitter, the Michigan coaching staff is not giving up on Junior Colson after 2 years. And I'm not even saying I've been impressed with Junior Colson to this point. I haven't been. But they are going to wait and give him another year before we have any, hard decisions or tough roads to cross. Meritocracy, if the world was a complete meritocracy, right? I think Marlowe would have a spot here. But I just think with how many linebackers they have, potential IRing of Colson, and then you already have Phillips and Dye who do a lot of your special team stuff, in addition to Dayon and Denzel off at the top of the rotation. I didn't have a spot that I could have here for Wax, which sucks because he was fucking awesome against the Niners. He's been great this whole preseason. So I really wish I could find a spot for him. Again, great special teams guy, great defensive guy last night, forcing fumbles. He knew it was time to play and time to go, along with Nikko Reed, who we'll talk about a little bit later. Unfortunately, the roster math just wasn't mathing for him, in my honest opinion. So that brings us up to, we were at 35. Now we're at 39 with those 4 linebackers. Safeties: Derwin James, Elijah Molden, Alohi Gilman, Tony Jefferson, and R.J. Mickens. I did have those guys making it. Tony is someone who I think is an interesting conversation because I think if this was last year and we were making the roster, Tony did make the initial 53, but then they cut him and did the practice squad game with him last year. I don't think they can afford to do the practice squad game this year. Tony, since then, has put up a year of good tape, both in the regular season, both preseasons. And so I think that he's someone that's going to be, a clear part of their rotation here. There was an injury to Alohi Gilman in practice this week, and Tony was the guy who, kind of subbed in and took his place. Pretty clearly that they're going to, trust him to really be the 4th safety right now. But obviously with how R.J. Mickens has played, I don't think you're cutting him either. I think he's pretty firmly above the cut line, just out of fear of waiver claims, to be honest. But also, he's earned a spot, even though he could be inactive some weeks, or maybe he's just going to be core special teamer this year with Derwin, Molden, Alohi, and Tony in the conversation. But, credit to Tony, too, who came back. Not a lot of people believed in him coming out of retirement. And this is his back-to-back preseason All-Pros. Not too many better stories to talk about on the Chargers roster than just that. He bet on himself, he believed in himself, and I think he's going to make this roster. And, frankly, kind of like I said earlier, if they did cut Tony or they did something like that, I really think he would have a bunch of opportunities littered throughout the league to be a 3rd, 4th safety somewhere else that were not available to him this time a year ago as he was coming out of retirement. So I have him on the roster simply because he's been really good this preseason, but also I don't think they can play the same roster game that they played with him last year with practice squad, main roster, practice squad, main roster. That's just kind of my thought process for the time being. Safety, also to mention for the practice squad, let's look at their depth chart real quick. I wanted to mention Kendall Williamson, who I think overall has played pretty well as a practice squad guy. He's someone that Ryan Ficken has talked about a lot as a potential core practice squad special teamer. Not that that's necessarily a thing as a core practice squad special teamer, but I think he's going to probably have first dibs out of that safety group when they pick a guy to sort of make the main initial 16, 17-man practice squad, depending on what they do. If they use the extra spot with Thomas Yasmin, who's International Player Pathway Program. I have 6 cornerbacks, and this was what kept me up at night. This is what I was, sitting with since the game. I have Dante Jackson, Tarheeb Still, Cam Hart, St. Just, Ja'Sir Taylor, Nikko Reed. Ja is obviously someone who's been of a lot of conversation. I did initially cut him in my Friday roster prediction, but the more I thought about it, the more I sat on it, I just couldn't see a path to cutting Ja. Especially because, yes, Derwin's going to be playing a lot of the slot, but, truthfully on their roster, if Tarheeb is starting, they don't really have, a backup slot right now, and that's, a little less important with Derwin in the rotation, who's, of course, going to be playing a lot of slot, as he did as an all-pro slot corner last year. But I did still think that defensive roster relevance, in addition to his special teams roster relevance, probably keeps Ja on the team. And I found a spot for Nikko Reed, as an undrafted free agent, who I think played really well, head on fire, with the in the Niners game last night. But ever since the Hall of Fame game, I think has come to play really well. I don't think he has much of a role on the team this year, just as a smaller corner in their kind of field of bigger corners and guys that, clearly, as Jesse Minter said, Dante Jackson, Tarheeb, Cam, and St. Just is that starting rotation for them. But I think he's someone that, while he probably won't be on the roster the whole year, just as far as hey, can we get a spot for a guy? I think the Chargers should have a vested interest in keeping him out of these initial claims before maybe eventually placing him on the practice squad, because of how well he's obviously played this preseason. And then cornerbacks that I think could make the practice squad, you obviously have Eric Rodgers, who has a high ankle sprain, or might have that kind of an injury that I think he's dealing with right now. So he's someone that I think can make the practice squad. Miles Purchase could make the practice squad. Trikweze Bridges, who was their 7th round pick, even though he hasn't performed to that level this preseason, is also someone that I could see making the practice squad. So that brings us to 50 on the main roster. And then the 53 are, of course, your special team specialists in Cam Dicker, J.K. Scott, and Josh Harris. Interesting note about Josh Harris last night. He was injured, and they did have Tucker Fisk come in as long snapper. So how serious is Josh Harris's injury, even though I initially have him here? That's something to note going forward, because they either play Fisk at long snapper or they have to bring in another long snapper and place Josh Harris on IR. Again, too early to jump to conclusions on just how serious that injury is, but something worth noting just in the creation of the 53-man roster here and some of the, moves to watch as far as their injuries and stuff like that. So, to recap my roster: 2 quarterbacks, Justin Herbert, Trey Lance; 3 running backs, Omarion Hampton, Hassan Haskins, Raheem Sanders; 1 fullback, Scott Madlock; 6 wide receivers, Trey Harris, Keenan Allen, Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, Keandre Lambert-Smith, and of course, Darius Davis. I do have 4 tight ends. That is Will Dissly, Aronde Gadsden, Tyler Conklin, and then Fisk. I have 8 offensive linemen. I do think they will add a 9th and probably cut one of those guys that I mentioned that is kind of on the roster line. But I just don't see the point in keeping David Sharp if you don't think he's a serious swing tackle option right now. And ultimately, I would rather prioritize keeping someone like a Fisk on the initial 53 than I would David Sharp, especially if you are going to maybe be aggressive and make another offensive line move or a waiver claim or something that brings an offensive lineman in here. But for the now, I do have Joe Alt, Zion Johnson, Bradley Bozeman, Mekhi Becton, Trey Pipkins, Jamari Sallier, Branson Taylor, and Andre James as your backup center. So I do think they will at some point bring in, sign, trade, waiver claim an offensive lineman. Defensive line: Tier Tart, Otito Ogbonya, Deshaun Hand, Jamari Caldwell, Justin Igboigbe, Naquan Jones. 5 edge rushers: Khalil Mack, Tuli Tuipulotu, Bud Dupree, Caleb Murphy, Kyle Kennard. 4 linebackers: Deion Henley, Denzel Perriman, Troy Dye, Delshon Phillips, and IR Junior Colson, at least for the first 4 games on the designated for return IR based off of just what we've heard of practice. Making some assumptions and leaps there, but we'll kind of see. 5 safeties, Derwin, Molden, Gilman, Tony, RJ Mickens. 6 corners, at least on the initial roster. Not saying Nikko Reed is going to be there all year, but I do think that they at least keep him out of the waiver claims for the time being. While these 53-man rosters are being created, Dante Jackson, Tareeb Still, Cam Hart, Ben St. Juice, Jossier Taylor, Nikko Reed, and then of course you have your 3 specialists, Cam Dicker, J.K. Scott, and Josh Harris. Like I said, this has been the hardest roster to make in a while. I think there are going to be areas where I'm wrong. I think there's going to be areas where Steven and Tyler are wrong. I think there's going to be areas where Ram and Popper are wrong. This is a truly deeper roster than they've had in recent years. And then you have the stuff like Najee hanging over it. You have the stuff like who's going on IR hanging over it. So I think it'll be pretty interesting to see over the next couple days how they build out this roster. But some of the areas, just to highlight kind of like the 5 bubble guys, if you will. I put Kimani in that mix just because they have kept 4 running backs in the past, so it wouldn't surprise me if they kept him. Heineke, I mentioned if they're searching for a trade, but I'm pretty doubtful about that one, to be totally honest. David Sharp is someone who's obviously pretty clearly on the bubble right now. As far as do they bring in another offensive lineman? Tucker Fisk is someone that I just think if they make a waiver claim or 2, he would probably be one of those first guys off the roster that I initially had. And then down the line of the defensive roster, even though I have Nikko Reed making this iteration of the roster, like I said, I don't think he's probably going to be there the whole year. I think their goal would just be to kind of keep him out of the waiver claims for now. So, again, he's someone that's worth watching. And then that's really about it. I think everything else on the roster defensively is kind of set. But that'll do it for me today, guys. Thank you for joining me. It has been an absolute pleasure to cover this offseason and do all the stuff. I don't take it for granted that it's more of a privilege, certainly, than a right to be able to do this content here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. So thank you to you all for watching. Go make your 53-man roster predictions. If you go to Daniel Popper's Hops with Pop community, he has a competition there for the 53 if you want to enter that one. But I don't feel great about this roster prediction, but after pacing around for 40 minutes ferociously in my house, this is where I landed. So now we will be back into the bulk breakdowns, normal schedule coming on after games. So I will be doing an episode following the Chiefs game. So that will be the next episode, the next time that I talk to you guys on September the 6th. So that's Saturday after the Chiefs game. I will talk to you guys then. As always, see you later. Love you guys, and bolt up.